Hello audience, Mr. Z here with one sure doozy of an alternate history scenario for you. What if Rome colonized America? Let's assume that Rome at its imperial peak managed to send out a large colonization group out west, knowing there was vast unclaimed land ripe for conquest. Putting aside Carthage, the state of Roman sea travel, and the ability to transport a party large enough to establish a permanent settlement, let's just say that none of that is an issue and Rome does get to the Americas without any issues. Now, I've touched upon a similar subject in my What If the Vikings Stayed in America video. However, I could imagine the Romans taking a far more aggressive approach to colonization than the Vikings did, especially considering that 1, the Vikings were on more of an exploratory mission, and 2, the Vikings were fairly on par with the natives in terms of weaponry. Now, you might ask how Europeans seemingly regressed during the 1,000-year span between the Vikings and the Romans, and the answer is simply the setback of the Dark Ages. During the entire period, the natives had every opportunity to continue refining the weaponry and fighting tactics, while Europe not only stagnated technologically, but lost much of the order and advancements pioneered and refined by the Romans. But take that back about 1,000 years, and you now have the natives in an even more primitive state, going up against invaders of equal or greater strength to the Vikings. Most would see enslavement as typical of Roman conquests, while some, if cooperative, may establish alliances with and join the ranks of the Romans, who would begin restructuring the American coast with ports capable of carrying return vessels and possibly even new arriving vessels from Europe. Skirmishes would certainly become more frequent as the Romans pushed even further in mainland, however would be mere brush-offs to the superior Roman armor, combat techniques, and weapons. Expansion would stop a bit short of the Appalachian Mountains, and as work began on the first Roman-American city. The bountiful resources of the land would provide a plentiful supply of materials for the Roman settlements, which would grow into a super city with a developing fleet of ships preparing to return word to the Empire. The Empire would likely utilize the Americas as a secret launching point for Roman ships to intercept or surprise enemy vessels from the southwest, and thus transport more supplies and colonists for permanent residency to help the American colony thrive. That would be the routine until Rome began seeing heavy decline and would no longer be able to afford sending ships all the way to the American continent. The Roman-American colony, which would now encompass the entire eastern coast of the continent, would be left on its own, a situation which would prove to be not much of an inconvenience, as it was fairly self-sufficient with a ruling government which would assert more independence as its connections to Rome grew fainter and fainter. Soon the American colony would fall out of memory of the Roman public, however, as signs of decay became apparent to the upper class, so would considerations be made to create an escape plan to evacuate en masse, though depending on who's in charge at the time, it's easy to imagine this hitting many walls before finally hitting off the ground. But eventually, as Rome is sacked and the empire shows no hope of recovery, so would many of the last Romans with knowledge of the American colonies sail away from their homes never to return in hopes of finding something better, though what they find certainly wouldn't be what they expected. The Roman evacuees would come to behold the new empire of Terra Nova, a shining beacon of hope and an untouched sanctuary for the Roman people and culture. As the old empire fell, so would nearly all knowledge of the new land be lost, only existing as a myth, the likes of Atlantis or El Dorado. However, it would be the allure of this myth that motivates the Vikings hundreds of years later to pursue this mysterious land, sending a small expedition team near Greenland only for them to never return. A larger expedition team would be sent a second time around, establishing a campsite in Iceland, discovering traces of vaguely Roman civilization, which would serve as enough justification to send out further expeditions to colonize Greenland and create a launch-off point for further expansion into the Americas. Almost as quickly as it began, it would come to an end, as the Terra Novans rapidly encircle and capture the Viking settlers, not only outnumbering them, but outmatching them with gunpowder-based weapons. Not only guns, but explosives, and lots of them. This intrusion into the land of Terra Nova would be perceived as a prelude to an invasion by the very barbarians who sieged their motherland centuries ago. There would be a general xenophobia amongst the Roman descendants, having been taught throughout the generations of how their old empire collapsed under the weight of foreign hordes, destabilized the legion, split the empire into two, and brought chaos to their streets. So it's clear that the Vikings would not be returning to Europe out of sheer fear that the safety of their new home could be compromised. However, that would not be the end of it. Attempts would be made to learn as much about Europe as possible from the captured Vikings, while scout ships would be sent out to survey the continent. Word would return to Terra Nova that the European continent is technologically inferior and highly disorganized, leading the heads of state to contemplate a potential reconquest of Europe under Roman rule. Launching points would be established off the coast of what in our timeline would be Brazil, and launching into the far west of Africa, while an enormous force is mobilized in Greenland for a full-scale invasion of Britain and Scandinavia. Terra Novan forces would lay siege to the British Islands, while massive armed forces touched ground on the soils of Norway, all whilst a push is made from northwest Africa into Spain and Italy, Utilization of incendiary and projectile-based weaponry would prove overwhelming for many of the proto-empires, inspiring large migration and military recolonization of various strategic locations including Britain, Spain, and North Africa, and locking itself within a decades-long reconquest of much of its lost empire. Relatively speaking, this would prove to be a simple feat for Terra Nova. However, it would be only after that they would discover their true competitors. The Fatimid Caliphate, who they would have had skirmishes with across North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, who would have been brought into the conflict with the Roman invasion of Italy and the Baltics, the Ghaznavid Empire further down into the Middle East, and potentially even the Song dynasty of China, had expansion been made into the east from the Pacific coast. Now, Byzantium by this point was nearing its last leg and was as technologically developed as Terra Nova. As a matter of fact, all these empires really had going for them to distinguish from the many other empires at the time was organization and technological achievement, which to Terra Nova were small potatoes compared to what they had going for them. Generations upon generations of refining and advancing the Roman techniques of old, adapting the use of progressively more advanced weaponry, and experience navigating and conquering various terrain within the Americas would make the Terra Novans capable of toppling nearly all these empires with forests, desert, plains, and mountains. They had in essence become the perfect conquest machines. The only empires which might rival their technology in number would be the Mongols and Song China, who had also made numerous advances in gunpowder-based weaponry, from primitive flamethrowers to early grenades, mines, and handheld firearms. Together, these two forces could deliver a strong enough push against the Terra Novans, but that's unlikely, as these factions were at the time at odds with each other, and while the Mongols were renowned for their numbers and tactics, their weaponry was fairly primitive until the 14th century when gunpowder would begin to be in use worldwide. What this means is a brutal and slow but gradual push into the east, soon cementing the Terra Novans as the sole global superpower, and re-establishing the Roman Empire centuries after it was thought gone. And that is where I'm gonna end today's video. Thank you all for watching, be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.